Hey students, welcome to my lecture on Sigmund Freud. And part of the reason I have chosen to do a lecture on Freud is that while there are numerous individuals that you have been reading about in chapter 1 that are important to the field of psychology, if you were to ask the general person on the street to name an important figure from psychology, I think there'd be a good chance they would say Sigmund Freud. And so partly because he is recognizable, but also because he has an interesting political and professional sort of connection to psychology. He wanted to be trained as a medical doctor, and he was trained as a medical doctor, but he also had a lot to do with introducing concepts into psychology that aren't necessarily medical or material. And his influence certainly transcended the field of psychology as an academic discipline and with his own psychoanalysis as a practice. He, at the end of his life, was very concerned about global and macro issues, and that's some of the things I'm going to talk about in my lecture on Freud. But before I get to Freud, there were certainly people who were doing things related to psychology before Freud, and I want to spend some time talking about some of these individuals. One of them would have been Thomas Beddoes, and Beddoes was an Oxford-educated doctor who also did some training in Scotland and Germany, and Beddoes lived mostly near the end of the 18th century. And before England started realizing many of the detrimental effects of the Industrial Revolution, Beddoes was one of the people who was first concerned with the idea of public health. And he believed that there probably would be a way to prevent diseases and things from happening, cholera outbreaks, if we just focused on health. He also experimented with nitrous oxide as an anesthetic, and we will see some other very interesting drugs that were used as anesthesia in the history of medicine and in some of these psychological forebears. Beddoes also believed in sex education, and he would have been an early feminist who believed that women were just as capable of men, certainly mentally. And an illness, and we will talk about this here in more depth, but an illness that was strictly associated with women for a long time was hysteria. But Beddoes believed that he had seen what he called sort of a male form of hysteria with the idea of hypochondria. And another insight that Beddoes had was as he observed some of his patients who had what he called low spirits, he sensed some sort of a connection between these low spirits and the patient's health. And we think that this may have been some of the first sort of clinical observations of what we today call bipolar disorder. And then lastly, and this would be something that Freud would certainly pick up on in some of his theorizing, Beddoes believed that there might be certain illnesses that were caused by, quote, passions without gratification. And what that means in a larger sense, students, is this idea that there could be physiological things that happen to us, stress, other things that could also cause psychological illness. Another seminal thinker and figure, and one who is mentioned in chapter 1 of the textbook, was William James. And James lived in the middle of the 19th century and died in the first decade or so of the 20th century. And he is often considered the father of American psychology, but he is also one of the early pragmatist philosophers. And he attended Harvard, as did many people at this time. It was certainly one of the elite institutions as it is today. And he was trained as a medical doctor, but also given some training in physiology. And he opened one of the earliest psychology labs at Harvard in the 1870s. And as the textbook mentions, his Principles of Psychology, which is a 2-volume work, was one of the fundamental foundational texts in psychology and still has some use today. And one of the many ideas that James contributes to psychology is an exploration of the notion of consciousness. And he will later, and I'll talk about this, he will later write an essay about consciousness, but one of his contributions is this idea of stream of consciousness. And so if you've had to suffer, and I say this as a comparative literature major, so I mean it somewhat jokingly, but if you had to suffer through reading Virginia Woolf or James Joyce or William Faulkner, authors who are often considered to write in a stream of consciousness style, you might have William James to blame for that, because James didn't see consciousness as distinct parts, but as this stream, if you will. Okay. Something else that James did was he looked at religion and the importance of belief. And his first contribution to this field would have been The Will to Believe that he published in 1896. And this is where we see some of his ideas of pragmatism coming into play, students, because pragmatism is a philosophy that looks at the value of things. And so for James in this book, he wanted to see, does religion have a role and a benefit, not based on whether or not it's true, but on how it can contribute positively to individuals and to society. And then a few years later, he wrote another book that's still very important and was one of the first books that we can point to in the development of the academic study of religion, and that was called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he looked more closely at religion. A couple of years after that, he wrote an essay called Does Consciousness Exist? And here he is challenging the long held notion of Rene Descartes and this subject object relationship. And I spoke about Descartes in my Psychology Before Psychology video. And if you remember, Descartes was famous for saying, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. And that implied that there was a thinking subject. And then the object would be the thoughts themselves. Well, James didn't necessarily believe that was valid. And instead, he, again, looking at consciousness, believed that consciousness probably shouldn't be separated from sensations and experiences. In other words, it's not something disembodied. And then, just for curiosity's sake, perhaps, we do know that at one time they had a very brief meeting, William James and Sigmund Freud. Freud was probably in America at that time. He had become quite a celebrity and was doing a lecture tour. And he probably went to sort of pay his respects to an elder in the field of psychology like James. Okay. But more about Freud now. Freud, we know, was born in 1856 in a town that is now part of the Czech Republic. And there is his birth house. But we know that early on his family moved to Vienna. And that's where he would spend, for the most part, the rest of his life. And Vienna was this real circle of intellectual ferment, not just in psychology, but in music and in the arts and in science and in literature. If perhaps we hadn't had World War I and II, we might be speaking today of a Viennese Renaissance. And Freud goes on to earn his degree from the University of Vienna. Now, and we had the same thing happen with Karl Marx because they were both Jewish. Freud really wanted a career in academia. He wanted to become a professor. But some of his professors who liked him told him that that was likely not to happen because of his Jewish ancestry. So instead, Freud enters medical school and he trains at the Vienna General Hospital, pictured here. And he was exposed to a variety of approaches, but some of his earlier teachers would have been what we would have called mechanists and people who were looking for material explanations. One of those would have been Theodor Meinert, and Meinert allowed Freud to do an internship with him in his psychiatric clinic in 1883, and Meinert was of the belief that there would be neurological processes that might have an influence on our psychology. So looking at the mind, looking at the brain. Karl Kohler was another colleague of Freud, and Kohler is often credited with being the first person to use cocaine as an anesthetic. Yes, that's right, cocaine. We don't do that anymore, and for good reason, but Freud thought it was legitimate enough that when his own father Jakob needed eye surgery, and Kohler was gonna do the surgery, that Freud allowed Kohler to use cocaine to anesthetize Sigmund Freud's father. Further influences were these group of men, as I mentioned, that were called the mechanists, and this idea that the human body is just a machine, maybe a fine-tuned machine, but a machine nonetheless. And Ernst Bruck was one of these people, and he believed, as it says, that exchanges of energy between living and non-living matter is how we can maybe explain the vital functions in the human body. Another would have been Hermann Helmholtz, and Helmholtz studied how impulses are transmitted by the nerves. So he was one of the first people to look at the nervous system. And again, this is a material and a physiological explanation, students, for things that we might consider to be our mind and consciousness. Joseph Breuer was someone who Freud even collaborated with, as you can see here in this volume on studies on hysteria. And Breuer used what he called the talking cure. And he was working with women who were considered to have hysteria as a medical condition. And during Freud's medical training, he had a grant where he was allowed to go and work with Jean-Martin Charcot. And Charcot, who had his own sort of medical clinic in France, was also studying hysteria, but he was not only wanting to treat whatever kind of physiological issues there were, but in mental issues that he would term neurosis. And Charcot theorized that perhaps we could explain hysteria through brain degeneration, and not just through what it normally is explained by. And like Beddoes before him, Charcot didn't think hysteria was something that only women would be able to get or to suffer from. And if you didn't know, the term hysteria derives its meaning, and the etymology of hysteria comes from the word hyster, which is how we would say uterus. In other words, this is why it was only believed that women could be hysterical, because men didn't have uterus. And so, unfortunately, often the treatment for hysteria was to remove the woman's uterus in what is called a hysterectomy. But Freud and Beddoes and Charcot started to argue that we can think of hysteria as being something that men can also suffer from. And in 1886, the same year he had been doing his internship with Charcot, Freud presented a paper to the Viennese Medical Society on male hysteria. Okay, then about 1900, he began publishing work based on his own research and his own clinical experiences with patients. And here is a picture of what the office, the place, the clinic where Freud might have treated his patients, using his own version of the talking cure from Breuer that has come down to us as psychoanalysis. However, Freud, like William James, was interested in other larger societal issues too, and in 1927, he publishes a very, very strong critique of organized religion called The Future of an Illusion. And you can see here the main points of that work. One, that religious beliefs, they can't be proven or disproven. Some of them seem quite improbable, virgin birth, other things. Some things, they don't make sense with the world that we know and the world that we live in. And they are based not really on experiences that are universal. One person, Joan of Arc, may say that she had a religious experience, but why didn't the rest of the people in France have those same experiences? And it wasn't rational, and rationality was a big thing for Freud. Remember, he was a medical doctor, he had trained with scientists, and he believed instead that religious beliefs are wish fulfillment or wish thinking, and therefore they are illusions. And because people believe in these religious illusions, that is dangerous to themselves and to society. But what about his own contributions in psychoanalysis? Well, interestingly enough, for somebody who seemed to be a mechanist and a materialist, Freud noted that the word psyche, if we go back to the Greek etymology, means soul. And so here is probably the model that is most commonly known from Freud, the model of the id, ego, and superego. And remember that Beddoes had talked about passions without gratification. Well, Freud would call some of these principles. So we had the pleasure principle. And the pleasure principle, you wanted pleasure whenever, wherever you could get it. And it was a very primitive, almost more of like a response, not something that you were necessarily even capable of controlling, as an impulse. And so the id was the part of your personality that was ruled by the pleasure principle. Opposed to that would have been the reality principle, and the ego is the part of your personality that would be in charge of that. And So just because you want to eat something or you want to take something doesn't mean that it's always going to be safe. And so if you just operated on your id, you might get in danger, you might even hurt yourself or perhaps even be killed. And so the reality principle helps keep that from happening. And the superego is believed to be the larger societal part of our personality that is formed by our home, our schools, and larger forces at play there. And it is this structure that is probably what is, most well known about Freud, and yet, with the exception perhaps of the id, which Freud believed might have been in our primitive part of the brain, he couldn't really identify where the ego and the superego resided. And so I find this not necessarily contradictory, but partially so, that somebody who had been trained to be so materialistic, so mechanistic, gives us a model of personality, part of which can't necessarily, at least not in his time, we couldn't find the physiological bases for part of the personality structure. Okay, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, part of why I wanted to talk about Freud is that Freud also was looking at larger political and societal issues. And so in 1929, now you have to remember 1929 would have been after the First World War, but before the Second World War. Still, the First World War had been brutal on Europe and European society, killing millions and millions of people, almost wiping out entire generations in some of the countries like France and Germany and Russia. And so in 29, Freud publishes Civilization and Its Discontents. And in this book, he's concerned with the origins and future of human civilization. He has to go into exile in the late 1930s after Adolf Hitler rises to power, a fellow Austrian, and he is living in exile in England when he takes a lethal overdose of morphine and essentially commits suicide. Okay, so in this work, Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud is positing that all life is a struggle between two forces, the love instinct, which he calls eros, and the death instinct, which he calls thanatos. And that society is going to have to battle. At this time in 1939, again, Hitler had risen to power. We'd had World War I. World War II seemed right around the corner. I think Freud might have been putting his money on thanatos, or the death instinct. And so what this shows you is that psychiatrists, psychologists, psychoanalysts aren't just concerned with individual patients working in relative isolation, but someone like Freud wanted to take these processes, these analyses, and put them into a larger world context. All right, students, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again soon. Take care.